Okay, here we are. So we're doing this for all the people who are gathered here, as well as for the millions who will be watching us on the recording. So, and we're going to talk about this book, The Containment, which is about perhaps one of the most important Supreme Court cases that many people are not very familiar with. The author of this book, we'll get into that in a minute. My name is Rick Banks. I'm a faculty member here at the law school. I'll just say we have many sponsors of this event. There are many cooks who've been in the kitchen. Thank you for everybody for supporting. We deeply appreciate that. I'm a professor at the law school and also the director of the Center for Racial Justice. And I am here with Michelle Adams, who is a law professor at the University of Michigan. We go back long ago, to a long time ago, before she was in Michigan.
That's right.
And I can't remember when you first started talking about this book, or your research on this book. But I know it has been years.
Yeah, it's been years.
And I will just say, there are a lot of good things I could say, but I tend not to do that because I don't want to make you blush. So I'll just say this book received an extraordinary review in the New York Times. And it is the result of many years of painstaking research and a lot of Michelle's heart has gone into this book and is contained within this book as a child of Detroit, Michigan, which is where the story takes place. So I am delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Delighted to be here with you. I am delighted that you wrote this book. I think of this as this is a gift, as good books are, not only to the people that are here now, but for generations to come, because people are going to look back and try to make sense of what's happened in our nation and the trajectory of education in our nation and education equality in our nation. And this will be one of the books they'll reference, quite genuinely. People will look back 50 years from now and be reading this book to try to understand how and where did we go wrong. So let's launch into it.
Okay.
So
a little emotional there, but I'm going to try to control it.
So Michelle, you talk about Milliken v. Bradley as a case that ended the era of school desegregation that was initiated by Brown v. Board of Education. What was can you elaborate on how Milliken, among all the different cases the Supreme Court decided, was so pivotal?
Okay, I'm going to do that. Let me first thank you guys for taking your time to be here with us this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I know there's a lot of other things you could be doing, so thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Rick, and thank you for everyone else who sponsored the event. I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to do is start by just sort of giving you a little bit of background about the case itself, meaning the case, how it led up to the Supreme Court. Then I'm going to tell you about what happened at the Supreme Court, and then I'll give a little answer to Rick's question, and then we'll keep going. Right, so the case begins in August of 1970. And at that point, the Detroit School Board had attempted to, and I'll get into some of the detail around this, institute a very limited integration plan. And for the first time in the history of Detroit's public schools, there are going to be white kids going to black schools and black kids going to white schools. Detroit had been running a separate and unequal school system for generations. And the response to this was basically all hell breaks loose. And the state of Michigan essentially invalidated the school board's attempt to have a very limited integration plan in the high schools. And when the state of Michigan passed a law that did this, the NAACP got interested and basically said, you know what, that feels kind of Southern. Right? They're basically, we were going to have an integration plan, and now we're not. It's going to be we're going to be pro-segregation in the state of Michigan, and so the NAACP gets involved, decides to sue about the fact that this law had overturned this integration plan. Long story short, the case ends up taking on a much broader array of issues, and it gets brought in front of a judge, and this judge is somebody who initially thinks that the plaintiffs are crazy, doesn't really believe them, thinks the NAACP should get out of his courtroom. And then over the course of 41 days, they put on this extraordinary trial, which I want to talk to you a little bit more about. But just to set the stage, this district judge, who initially sort of was very skeptical of the plaintiffs' claims, ultimately ruled that state and local officials had intentionally segregated the schools in Detroit. That was the liability holding. and that he was serious about Brown versus Board of Education. Now remember, this is the North, and it's still the early 1970s, and there's not a lot of guidance from the United States Supreme Court. Most of the cases, in fact, all of the cases the Supreme Court had decided with respect to school segregation had been in the South or border states. So the big question for the lawyers is, as they're moving forward with this case, is, well, how do we show that there's actually a Brown violation in the city of Detroit? Because there's no state law that requires segregation here. In fact, there's a state law that prohibits it. But ultimately, they put on this big trial. We'll talk about that. And the district court judge says, yes, there's been segregation. Yes, we're going to do something about it. Yes, Brown applies in the North. And yes, we're going to have meaningful desegregation. By then, the school system is about 2/3 black, 1/3 white, and the white residents are leaving the city of Detroit. And he says, you know what? Because the state of Michigan was involved and had violated the Constitution, we're going to include 50 some odd suburban school districts, along with the city of Detroit, in a massive multi-district metropolitan school desegregation order. It would have been the largest in the history of the United States. Now, this gets upheld not once but twice by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. We get the Supreme Court. This is a long answer to your question. And the Supreme Court in Milliken versus Bradley strikes this down, the remedy part, the metropolitan portion, and strikes it down by a vote of 5-4 with Justice Marshall writing a very prescient dissent. Okay, so then Rick's question was, well, why did it end the Brown era? So that's your thumbnail sketch of the case. I think it ended the Brown era because Brown is a case. How many folks are affiliated with the law school here, or either in law school, law professors? So some, right? Yeah. So all of us are familiar with Brown in one way or another. But if you recall, think back to the case. It's very short. It was written for public consumption. It's not the way the Supreme Court writes cases now at all. And it was, crucially, it was unanimous. And the price for that, getting all the 9 votes to agree, was to be very ambiguous in terms of, there's a lot of different ways you could read the Brown case, right? One of the ways to read the Brown case, the way that Michelle Adams would like to read it, is that it's a broad, sort of pro-democracy, pro-African-American citizenship, moving us closer to the nation that we want to be kind of case. That there's the potential within Brown to take us closer to the multiracial democracy that we want to be and that we hope we could be. And that possibility was open. And there was a moment in time where sort of what Brown was about was being discussed, and it wasn't, all the pieces weren't put together. It was like a jigsaw puzzle with the pieces missing. And one of the crucial things that Milliken versus Bradley does is say, well, basically, that really broad understanding, that pro-democracy understanding of Brown, that's not the way we're going to go, right? We're not going to, as Justice Breyer said in another case, try to create one nation rather than two. We're going to say that school district lines and county lines and city lines and suburban lines can divide us. Right, we can just shift from segregation at the school level to segregation at the school district level. And so that broad understanding of Brown, I think, really comes under fire and I think sort of loses the argument in Milliken versus Bradley. It doesn't mean that there aren't other important cases that we can talk about, but I think Milliken versus Bradley is a central important case to understand. And, as a law professor, when you sort of look at the race law books, Rick's got a book. In Rick's book, there's actually much more sort of coverage of Milliken versus Bradley, but that's unique and new. In the constitutional law textbooks, it's not something that we typically teach in any great detail. And I think that Milliken versus Bradley needs to come to the center of the law school curriculum as we understand sort of what Brown means, and from a democracy perspective, from a housing perspective, from a school perspective, and all the rest. So that's a long answer to your question.
Okay. That's a very good answer. So there's a lot to unfold here. The idea of containment is in the title of the book and is central to the book. Could you talk some about what are the dynamics of containment, both as you saw them working during the time of the case, and then to what extent are those dynamics of containment still at play?
So yes, the book is called The Containment. So there's a reason for that, and the reason is because, remember I told you about the judge who sort of changes his mind. The NAACP lawyers change his mind. The case that they put on changes his mind. And so one of the themes in the book is sort of, what does it mean to be a good lawyer? What kind of choices do lawyers make? And crucially, the role of black judges is also a sub-theme in this book. But one of the things that the lawyers had to really, they were really concerned about was, remember I told you that sort of when the case starts, there's not a lot of Supreme Court guidance. So there they are in the trial court, and they've got to sort of figure out, well, how do we show that there's been a violation that's just like Brown, right? So just 2 seconds of constitutional law now. So we call de jure segregation, that's by law, right? And so if you're in, Mississippi or Alabama, and you look up and you see a sign that says whites only, that's pretty clear that's by law. But what do you do when there's no signs, right? What do you do when the law doesn't require students to be segregated? And so that's the issue that the lawyers had to deal with. How do you prove that in a northern jurisdiction? So you could just say, well, okay, we can trace all the segregation back to state actors, back to the school district or back to state education officials, and we can show that they chose to locate a new school in the center of a black community or a center of a white community intentionally to segregate. We can show that they're using specific kinds of school feeder programs, or that they are using school attendance measures with an eye towards segregation and a variety of things. But the problem is in the North, there have been some other lower court cases, and in those cases, the school authorities would say, you know what, well, there might be segregation, but we didn't cause it, right? They would choose what we call facially neutral rules, like the neighborhood school rule. It says you got to go to school in the neighborhood that you live in, which is the sort of most popular, tool in the toolkit, right? And, lots of defendants had just said, well, we didn't cause any segregation. And so for the lawyers in the Milliken case, they had to show that the relationship between housing and schools. And the reason why the litigation itself was so interesting and so complicated, and this takes us back to the containment, is that they put on a housing case within a school case. So a 41-day trial, 10 days of which are entirely on residential segregation. What is the residential segregation portion of the case about? It's about the containment. It's about how in the city of Detroit, black folks are segregated not just within particular schools, but within particular neighborhoods. And the question becomes, well, how and why and who is actually doing that segregation? So then you start talking about racially restrictive covenants, and you start talking about intentionally segregating public housing, and you start talking about white neighborhood groups with violent tendencies, and you start talking about the role of the Federal Housing Administration, and you start talking about redlining, and you start talking about a literal segregation wall that is actually not that far from where I grew up, and I didn't even know about it, that had to be built because federal authorities said if you want to get access to federal mortgage guarantees to the developer, you have to basically create a hard and fast wall between the white houses you're going to build and this nascent black neighborhood, right? So there is a literal segregation wall in Detroit. I had no idea, right? So the containment was containing black folks in particular neighborhoods, and then once it became so crowded, they'd spill out of those neighborhoods and they'd be recontained again. And it was the containment theory that was the heart and soul of their litigation. But now think about the Supreme Court. By the time we get to the Supreme Court, if you read the Milliken case, the one that's in Rick's book, you would never know anything about this containment idea. There's nothing in there about it whatsoever, right? There's nothing about the liability finding, why was there a constitutional violation? Whose rights were violated? Nothing about anything like that. And in fact, there's a very famous footnote in one of the concurring opinions by Justice Stewart that says, well, we don't know why why black folks live where they live in Detroit. It's because of unknown and unknowable factors. I put a stake in that in this book. I just drove a stake through the heart of that, because it is impossible to look at what Justice Stewart said in that footnote and read 41 days of trial transcripts, which is what I did, which is represented here. right? And the containment was argued all the way up. It was in the briefs. It was on the first page of the plaintiff's briefs. And so the sort of counter-historical account that you get in the Milliken case just isn't true. It's just not true. And so I thank you, Rick, for talking about 50 years from now, but I realized there was a story there, and I just had to tell it.
So now I was planning to do this later, but let's switch over to the autobiographical somewhat, because you are from Detroit. Mm-hmm. You grew up in the area, have roots there. What's the autobiography behind this project? How did you come to write it? And
yeah,
I'm dying to know more about your engagement, interaction, and learning about the segregation wall.
Yeah.
The segregation wall.
So I had always been obsessed with Milliken versus Bradley because I was from Detroit, and I just kept reading about it, and at some point I figured out that there was this incredible story there, because the trial is the arc of the trial sort of tells the story, the trial itself, and we can talk more about the structure. But once I sort of figured out I wanted to try to write this book, and I had to develop a whole lot of skills I didn't have, so this for the students in the room to think about, sometimes it feels like you're climbing a mountain to figure out what's going on in law school, or climbing a mountain when you're starting out your first job. And it's like, I was never a journalist. I had to do interviews, right? I don't have a PhD in history. I don't have a PhD in sociology, right? I had to learn a wide variety of skills to be able to do the book, and I did that. But at some point, I realized that part of the story of the book is about, for me, it's about understanding my history and my roots and what it means, what personally it means for me to be Black. And it's not about me telling anybody else. It's about my sort of journey in that regard. And so going back to Detroit and asking the questions that I asked. And so there's a memoir wrapper on this book. In between, in the very beginning, I take the reader into the Supreme Court to an oral argument to a case called Parents Involved that we can talk about. And I sort of begin asking questions about why the oral argument is playing out the way it is. And I'm inviting the reader to step in with me and sort of use the skill of translation that I've developed over years to be able to teach. But then I want to talk about sort of like, I thought about my parents, and I started doing all this reading and reading the media of the time, and I started thinking about them, and I realized I started thinking about the story my mother told me about the house that I grew up in, and how they couldn't actually, she had this dream of dreaming her, she had a dream house that she wanted to build, like so many Americans do, and she had a neighborhood in mind, but she couldn't actually purchase the land. My mother and father couldn't purchase the land, so they had to use an intermediary, a white intermediary to do this. And I always use this as an example of the Fair Housing Act, because this is before the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. And so that was a little piece of the residential. And I sort of thought, well, that's a link that I've got to the past. And I also wanted to know more about what was going on in Detroit public schools, because I went to private school. My parents made a different choice for me. So all this is playing out in Detroit public schools, and I'm, 45 minutes away in a suburb. So all of this is happening, and it's a way for me to go back and kind of investigate how I grew up and sort of think about the person that I've become and sort of the journey that I took. And then at the end of the book, I go back to Detroit with the lessons that I've learned. And I go to the segregation wall that I mentioned, which I had never known about in the 18 years that I had lived there. And I walk around it, and I get a tour, and I think about it, and I try to just bring the reader into that moment. And for me, it was a way to try to take this whole story and package it in a way where people can relate to it. There's so many things that we do as legal scholars. We write law review articles, we write briefs, we write amicus briefs, we consult with legislators, we become judges. But this was something that I wanted to do to really be able to invite the reader in, to hold my scholarly audience, but to reach a general interest audience, but also to begin to put some pieces together for myself. So it's also a part of being the age that we are, too, and being able to sort of to reflect back and all of that. So that's sort of where that came from.
So now I think people want to know. So what were some of your reflections? I mean, how did the process change you and your understanding of your upbringing, your childhood?
I think that it made me more secure in what I thought I already believed. You know, when you read the book, I hope, if you've read the book, you know, there's these two contending, very familiar strains in Black political thought, and it turns out that they actually are quite important for the narrative of what's going on. So sort of this integrationist view and a more Black nationalist view. And I grew up sort of with my, you know, in the integrationist camp that was my parents' philosophy. But I took really seriously community control, Black nationalism. There's a particular character in the book who's very, very important in Detroit. And I thought all that through, and I really got deep into it. And I came out the other side sort of more secure in my particular belief, which is that I am a passionate proponent of integration for reasons that we can talk about, but not in and of itself for instrumentally for something else. And that something else is I'm pro-democracy. I am deeply pro-democracy, and the heroes in this book, white and Black, in ways big and small, are Democrats. Not necessarily Democratic Party members, but they are proponents of democracy. And I came out becoming even a stronger proponent of that. And we can talk more about that. But ultimately, I didn't know the book was going to end up being about citizenship, and about Black citizenship, and about sort of the promise of democracy that's encased within Brown. So I think I learned a lot and became more secure in that. But that could just also be getting, because we're getting older.
No, hey, well, this is a good time to reflect back.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You know, I said, as you get older, you know, when you're young, you don't think you'll live forever, but just maybe you might, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But then you get a little older and you realize you probably won't.
Probably not. Probably not.
Probably won't. So
probably not.
Time is limited. You did a lot of archival work, an extraordinary amount of archival work
Yes.
on this book, and you worked with a lot of primary sources.
Yes.
And tracked down materials in many different libraries. They weren't all in one place.
That is correct.
They weren't, you know, published and freely available. What were there things you found that especially surprised you, shocked you, that you just didn't anticipate when you started the process?
Damon Keith was a judge I had an opportunity. He's a player in the book. He's a character in the book who was on the Sixth Circuit, and he presided over another desegregation case that was going on at roughly the same time in Pontiac, Michigan, which is not really a suburb of Detroit, but it's sort of in the southeastern Michigan area, and he ordered desegregation within the city of Pontiac, and I was shocked by what was in his case file, because all of Damon Keith's papers are at Wayne State, and I spent a lot of time at the Walter Reuther Library. The history of Detroit is in Walter Reuther Library, and I distinctly remember one day going through his case file, in the Pontiac case file. And you know, back then in the old days, they had these things called bait stamps. I don't know if any people remember this, where you, if you ever clerked, all the material comes into the judge's chambers and it goes, and you get a bait stamp of the date. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, and the stuff that was coming in that was being sent to a federal judge was, I mean, you know, I'm not naive. I'm just not. But some of the material in there was so unbelievably racist. I mean, there were like diagrams, drawings, that was just like, wow, you know, like this is really bad. And what it did was it really gave me an appreciation, again, for Black judges. That was surprising. Second was a letter that appears in the book by a junior high school student who wrote the first Black member of the Detroit School Board about why she thought the high school integration plan was important. And it's just an extraordinary letter. And so when you go through archives, this is something I've also thought about. I've become passionate about archives when, you know, of course, I never gave a thought to archives. But now that we're in an internet phase, right, people used to write letters, you know, and the letters are in the archives. And you know, the letters are extraordinary, because writing a letter was like a formal thing. it wasn't something you like dashed off on like a napkin, right? So people would sit down and they would use a typewriter, right? So it wasn't easy to sort of, correct mistakes. And just sort of having a chance to look at those letters. But the junior high school students' letter, the stuff coming into the judge's file, some of the back and forth in terms of the litigation. We were very fortunate. The NAACP's records are all digitized, and this case was litigated by the NAACP, not LDF, not the Legal Defense Fund. And so there's so much material that's digitized where you can actually see what the lawyers were thinking. That kind of stuff was also just really fascinating.
That's fabulous. So I'm thinking now, we're moving around here a bit, but I'm thinking about the contemporary relevance of the case. So let's imagine the Supreme Court had decided Milliken differently, and that it had allowed the remedy that would have required the suburban districts to be part of the desegregation plan. What would have lied ahead of us on that road? Would that have brought us to a different place now? Was the court's decision, how pivotal was the court's decision in terms of shaping the trajectory or the lack of integration in the future?
So one of the things I talk to my students about, or I often ask them, is sort of, what's your theory of social change?
Yes.
So that's one thing to to sort of hang on to in answering the question. The other is no one has I can't go back and say, well, everything would have been different if it had just been 5-4 the other way. Like, there would be no President Trump or anything like that, and we would all be living in harmony, and it would be kumbaya, and we would have a theory of minimum entitlements read into the Constitution, and no. I think instead, my theory of social change is that we make an advance and then there's a backlash. That we are deep. My reading of American history, and again, I'm not a historian, but I read a bit, is that we run in cycles, and we're in a cycle right now. And so what you want to do is, when the cycle's running your way, to be able to get as far out as you can before the pushback comes. So I think here are a couple things that I think might be different. Number one, there were a number of copycat cases that were being litigated at the same time in lower courts. And the reason why the NAACP put so much money into this case, I think they spent between $900,000 and $1 million in today's dollars to litigate this case. That's a lot of money. And one of the reasons why Nate Jones wanted to do that, who was the general counsel, was because they believed that if they could win this case in Michigan, that they would be able to basically take it across the country. So that changes, and we aren't able to do that. But immediately after Milliken, the cases that were kind of, bubbling up start bubbling, because folks realize how difficult it's going to be. And we can talk the technical legal standard that you would need to be able to get these metropolitan remedies is quite high after Milliken versus Bradley. So we don't have that. So I'd like to believe that if it had gone the other way, we would have had some forward movement in those cases. And there would have been backlash. But we do have a record that suggests that once you can have durable, sustained integration, it turns out that folks kind of like it, right? Louisville is a good example of this, right? And one of the reasons why the book begins in the parents involved oral argument is because it had to do with the Louisville case and the Seattle case. In Louisville, after the Brown violation was cured, the parents wanted to keep having the program. They wanted to keep having desegregation, right? And it's other folks who basically say, no, you can't use race to do that. And they win in the Supreme Court. So I'd like to believe that if this had gone on long enough, number one, there would have been a generation of black students who would have been able to gain some of the hardcore benefits from integration, and we can discuss that. But I also think there might have been more white folks who would have realized it would have been a sort of a demand creation kind of scenario, even if there had been pushback, which there would have been, and there would have been backlash. But again, as we sort of see some of the empirical work around sort of white folks who go to integrated schools for under conditions of equality for a long period of time, you basically get a different product out of the educational process, right? Which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this. So I'd like to believe that we would have had more of that, and I wouldn't be writing a book about a tragic thing that happened, all those years ago. But would it have changed everything? No, because you've got to deal with all kinds of things. You've got to deal with school finance, right? You still got to deal with the fact that the school finance is so deeply involved with where we live and sort of the relationship between housing and schools. I mean, there's a whole lot of issues. Oh, and one more thing that I think hopefully would have been different. The crazy ahistorical nonsense that's in Milliken versus Bradley, hopefully if we just had a 5-4 going the other way, let's close our eyes and imagine for a moment that Thurgood Marshall writes the majority opinion in Milliken versus Bradley. He writes the majority opinion. You're going to know what the containment is, and you're not going to have to wait to look at a book like that to find out, right? Right, and so part of the thing is the Supreme Court is an institution that actually it creates official history, right? It sort of helps us understand what we think actually happened. So I think our understanding of what actually happened would be different if Thurgood Marshall had actually had the pen, writing in the majority. But would everything have changed? I doubt it.
Okay, and given your given that perspective, what should we do now? Should we be trying to one of the striking things about the current scene is that the ideal of integration has almost dropped off of the public agenda.
It has.
I mean, you don't hear politicians or school boards talking about that now. Should we try to recapture some sense of the importance of integration, or should we be focused on other issues in education?
Well, first of all, let me just go. I wrote the book to address the demand side, right? The reason the book is written the way that it's written for a broad audience, and which brings you in a kind of story, narrative scenario, is to help create demand. Because my hope is, although I know that we've got social media and fragmentation, and everybody's sort of narrowcasting into what they already think. But the idea is to actually create demand by sort of telling this incredibly engaging story. Do I think we should focus on it? Yeah, I actually do. I do think that different people have different views about this. I actually think that integration was a very successful social policy because it was sort of like a Swiss Army knife of social policies, right? Because you don't just get, in effect, resource transfers from whites to blacks, which is part of part of this is just green follows white, period, right? But what you also get is the effect on white students. And what you also get, if you look at some of the Louisville empirical evidence, is it turns out that when you have more sustainably integrated schools, it also has a follow-on, knock-on effect on the neighborhoods. So it's a Swiss Army knife social policy. It also tends, on average and over time, we'd like to believe, because we think about what the role of education plays, to move us closer to a more sustainable democracy. So yeah, I do think we should focus on it. But I think right now, and there's a bunch of sort of policy things that are not original to me that I kind of put together at the end of the book. But in order for folks to want to pursue some of these policies, you have to win elections. You got to win elections. And folks have to think that it's going to be useful for their kids, that it's going to be a good thing for their kids. And I think those are the kind of arguments we can make. But that was my contribution.
Okay, and how do you convince a parent of that? A parent who is obsessed with what's best for their child, and they look out and they see a really stratified educational landscape. Not only by race, but also by class, very much. How do you convince them that they should try to swim against the current? And
I think it's really hard. I think it's really hard, in part because there are lots of individuals in my book who do a lot of really wonderful things. But one of the lessons of the book is that there has to be a movement, and that trying to convince individual people is really useful, but it also needs to be part of what we want to achieve sort of as a social policy. Now, there's a bunch of things, right? There are lots and lots of groups that are working on this, but they're kind of under the radar. And I went to the National Coalition on School Diversity about a month ago and sort of talked to a bunch of people who are doing this work. And so you've got some like the Integrated Schools podcast, where you've got parents coming together and talking about this, who are starting to get really passionate about it. But your question was, how do I convince an individual parent? And I don't know that I would say anything different than what I just said a few minutes ago. The other piece from the empirical work that we've seen is that white children didn't get hurt, right? The whole big thing was, if we have integration, if we have desegregated schools, the white kids are going to fall behind and they're not going to do as well in school. Look, there's no empirical evidence to support that, right? So I mean, I think I would make a whole host of arguments, but I also might just say, look around at our present moment. How's that turning out for us? It's not turning out so great. So, but I think it is. I think it's one step in front of the other, and I'm out there trying to make the argument.
Okay, thank you for doing that. I have another question or two, but if people have questions, if you could just go to either mic, and then we'll take some questions in just a few minutes. Let me stick with that issue of where to go from here. One of the big impediments to school integration is actually housing integration. How optimistic or hopeful are you that we will do something to address inequalities and segregation in the domain of housing?
I think in this political moment, it's very difficult. I think right now it's an all hands on deck to just try to preserve what we've got. I think it's a different question. I think it's a higher level question about optimism. I am optimistic that we'll move past this moment, and I'm optimistic that our democracy will survive. I'm optimistic about that. I have great faith in that. I think in this moment, I think there has been and there will continue to be a lot of damage done. In terms of housing specifically, I mean, there's a larger question. And maybe I'm just going to go off now. We need to build more housing. We need to build much, much more housing, and I'm talking about in blue neighborhoods, in blue states, in blue cities. We need to recognize the idea of supply and demand in the housing market. If we build more housing, holding all things equal, with the neighborhood school rule operating as it does, it's still the default rule, though there are obviously there's significant amounts of ways that's not always the case. But if we build more housing in more neighborhoods near good schools, and the cost of the housing drops, and it becomes possible for more folks to move into those neighborhoods, they will then have access to the schools. So I think on housing, I'm a big supply side build person. I would also say that but we need to have more money put into housing vouchers so that individuals who can't afford Chetty's done a bunch of work on this, looking at sort of controlled choice with housing vouchers. When people are given lots of information, they go ahead and they make what we call more opportunity moves, and they can get access to not just the schools, but all the other good things that are happening in different areas. I think we need to bring the cost of housing down, and I think that will have a lot of knock-on impacts way beyond schools, just in terms of where we are now as a society. So, but at the moment, I think we've got to hold on to the democracy.
And my head was spinning. At first, I had a sense of where you were coming from politically, but then with this last series of sort of mini proposals, I started to wonder, how does that sit in the left-right divide, and who do you see? I mean, in what ways do you see the right or the left as either having the right approach or impediments?
I'm interested in good ideas.
Okay.
I'm interested in good ideas. So if you asked me earlier about sort of what I learned from the book, and I said, I learned that I was more secure in sort of what I think. So I'm not as worried about whether I'm going to be pigeonholed as left or right. Right? I'm just not, because in part, I think when you get out there and you start talking about integration, people are going to, the sort of perception, you've got a certain perception problem as it is, and I'm just over it. Right? You know, on the housing piece in particular, I'm just big on supply side, because I think that makes the cost of housing go down. And I think when the cost of housing goes down, more individuals of all races and all class backgrounds can have access to it. So I don't exactly know where that falls on the left or the right. Sometimes you got to make arguments to the left, and then people say, "Oh, that's something I thought all along." So yeah, I'm not as concerned about that. I think I've got extraordinary progressive values and progressive bona fides, but I do think that we've got a supply constraint problem when it comes to housing.
Right. But and what's on my mind here is that when you start to talk about housing, and then you talk about vouchers, and you talk about,
well, I'm talking about the housing voucher. I'm talking about the housing voucher.
Right.
Yeah, which is basically Section 8.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But these are the some of these ideas resonate more with things that you often hear from the right, frankly. When you talk about the importance of constructing housing and you want less regulation. So that was a bit of a...
Yeah. I mean, so then maybe that means that I can convince more people. So that's awesome.
Okay. What do you? So we're going to switch over if anyone has questions out there. What do you want people to individuals to take from the book? In other words, what do you want your readers to do after they read the book? How do you want not only their understanding of the world, but how they act in the world? How do you want that to be changed?
Well, first I want people to be moved, because I wrote the book to move people. I really worked hard on trying to craft the book. I wanted to write a story I wanted to read, and I wanted to write a story that would grab you intellectually, emotionally, psychologically. And then other than the things we talked about in terms of and we've just sort of discussed, like sort of things I think I need to have happen, I also want readers to sort of draw their own conclusions, right? And take this, sort of internalize it and take it and say, well, how is it that we can move in a direction that brings us together instead of pulling us apart? So that I think different people will take different lessons from it. The other thing I will say is that when I went to the National Coalition on School Diversity, it was really incredibly, intensely moving for me to see that the people who were working in the field felt validated, and they felt seen. And like the people who are working on Metco, and there's another program in Rochester, another one in Hartford. They've kind of been under the radar screen, and like people haven't been paying attention to them, and they felt seen. And to me, like that was it. Like if I get nothing else happens, like that's all that needed to happen, is for the people who are doing the work to feel validated and feel like they can continue to do that, which is so important.
That's a fabulous gift for them to do that. The struggles that you highlight in this story are, the struggles that happen in our society in many different settings, many different times, and often the people are forgotten. So it's extraordinary for you to be able to memorialize that and to bring to life the visions and the hopes and even the failures.
Yep.
In a sense. So
thank you.
We're going to throw it open to some questions here, because my wife always tells me I tend to talk too much, so I have a complex about that. So let's please share the mic if we can.
Well, one of my biggest fears right now is the Supreme Court around these vouchers for these religious schools. I just see that as a new dodge and a new way to now take public monies and put into a new segregation plan.
Did you listen to the argument? I haven't had a chance to do that yet.
I'm so undone. I'm just trying to take a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
Because every day is like too much,
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? Where's that
I mean,
You might want to say a bit about the case, because I don't know if everyone's
I
on the
don't
same
know.
page.
I don't know that I mean, Rick, you want to take that?
No.
Because I haven't looked at the case so closely. That's the reason why we're talking about the broad outlines of the case. As I understand it, are can government be required to have to pay for, if we're going to have a school voucher program, can government be required to have to use public money for religiously oriented schools?
And this is within the context of a really broad voucher movement across the nation, where
Right.
students receive
Right.
money from the
Right.
government that they can take and apply
Yeah.
to go to attend private schools.
Let me just say just a couple things about that, because we think about schools like sort of the archetypal vision of a public school, and then there's other things, right? So there's like magnet schools, there's charter schools, there's vouchers that, parents love choice, right? So we've got, whatever we're going to have to do, we're going to have to figure out a way to be able to work in choice, because we've got to reach parents where they are. Magnet schools historically have been much better in terms of having, of drawing in students from different racial backgrounds and different economic backgrounds. And the Magnet School Assistance Act, which is part of, I think, Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Educational Act, it has always been chronically underfunded, right? I've got a buddy of mine is running the Diverse Charter Schools Network, so she's doing a lot of work in terms of trying to make sure that charter schools, which historically have not been particularly well integrated, can be so. We were talking about vouchers earlier. The Section 8 vouchers, there's a long history to that. That's separate from the kind of vouchers that we're talking about in the educational context.
I'm from Wisconsin, the homeland of the voucher program, the originator of the voucher program. But I had a question in terms of creating demand. As a upper middle class white person who sent their kids to our local high school,
Yeah.
which was 30% white and 65% free and reduced lunch.
Yeah.
And we have two here at Stanford, that's why we're here. Other people said, well, how did, everyone, a lot of white people, a lot of upper middle class people want their kid to get into the Ivy League at Stanford. And I honestly think part of the reason two of our kids got in, they were smart, of course they're smart. But there's a lot of people, everyone who's here is a smart person, right? But there's a lot of smart people out there.
Yeah.
And the acceptance rate is 3%. And I honestly think part of the reason they got in was because they were different, right? They went to a school that was 65% poverty and 30% white.
Yeah.
And so they had a very different experience, as you speak to. They did. They had a very
Yeah.
wonderful experience, and it didn't compromise their education. But it was a tricky decision as a parent. It was our neighborhood school,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm a physician, and in the doctor's lounge, there was a lot of blowback. You're sending your kid where,
Yeah.
right? But part of me wonders, is there a way that the upper level schools that so many parents in my income bracket aspire to send their kids to, could the Ivy Leagues in Stanford create a demand by saying, hey, we preferentially, as much as they can, we'll take these kids that come from a diverse, economically, racially diverse setting.
Rick has written about this.
Oh, have you?
But we're focused on you.
Okay.
So I think it's a fabulous question. So the question is there anything that universities can do that could create effects at earlier stages in the system, since so many schools and parents are focused on universities as sort of the endpoint?
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive on this. Certainly universities could partner, right? And they could partner with school districts. They could identify particular neighborhoods or particular parts of cities and say, if students coming from those areas who do particularly well, we're going to offer automatic admit. I do not believe racial classifications and affirmative action in higher education. My personal view is that's over, right? So the point now is to move forward and figure out, and what we need to do. If you take a look at the Dear Colleague letter, for instance, it's one thing to say you can't use racial classifications when it comes to admissions. It's quite another to say that you can't use things like zip codes or some of the other things that Rick has written about with an eye towards trying to diversify the university. the Trump administration has basically taken the position that even having the thought in your mind that what you're trying to achieve is racial diversity, even if you use what's called the facially race-neutral methods, violates the Constitution. This is something I've been worried about for like 20 years, right? So I wrote a bunch of articles like in 1999 and then into the 2000s where I was like, wait a minute, I'm really worried about this. And then I just thought, well, I'm just crazy. I'm over, people would like, you're just like, chill. I was like, Michelle, chill. Right? I wrote an article called "The Last Wave of Affirmative Action," like 1999. It was this issue, right? Can you, do affirmative marketing and outreach, and will that trigger the equal protection problems, right? Well, the Trump administration thinks it does. That's wrong, and it's contrary to law, and it's contrary to actually parents involved, assuming that, if that case is still good law. So I think if that's the rubric, and I think we need to fight like hell to support that rubric, then I think there are creative things that universities could do, partnering. University of Michigan, I have to go back and look at it, but like Wolverine pathways, so you sort of say that, for these number of kids who are graduating from Detroit, shall we say, we're going to give direct admit, and then we're also going to look at the schools have to do a better job of economic integration too. We've got to focus on the class issue. So we could do both of those things. And I think universities should do both of those things, but I'm not an expert in this, and I haven't thought through exactly what the admissions process should look like.
Yeah. Please.
Am I cool?
Yeah, you should go to Mike. Go to Mike, and I'll ask my question while you're going to. As we think about this, I wonder, the segregation residentially is so deeply entrenched.
Yeah.
How much power do school district officials actually have? What specific decisions could school district officials make that would lead to meaningful racial integration?
Yeah, I feel like, and again, this is now I'm just drilling down. So Century Foundation did some work on this, right? And so one of the things I think they found was that even within districts, there are ways in which school authorities could create different feeder programs or create different student assignment mechanisms that would tend to create more integration even within particular districts, right? And so that wouldn't require actually crossing district lines, but it could be done. The issue there is will, right? So do we assume that every school district is doing its utmost to actually try to create socioeconomic integration within the bounds of the law? And I don't believe that they're currently doing that right now. So there are things they could do, but again, I think we're just back to demand, right? And trying to convince parents that it's not going to be detrimental to their children's educational and economic futures.
Okay. Please.
Hi.
So much. I had a couple point, and well, I'll jump to the question. So you mentioned a really interesting comment. You said you're pro-integration because you were pro-democracy, which is a kind of a really beautiful, pithy way to think about that. And I largely, that resonates with me. I'm curious, I want to ask you a question that only a lawyer could answer, right? Which is, I'm curious if you could argue the opposite point for me, and that is, I am pro-democracy, so therefore, I am pro-community building, right? Or pro-investment in existing segregated schools, and I'm pro-democracy, so that's where I land, or I pursue that because I'm pro-democracy, right? And the question comes up, right? Because we know that the tools, the levers by which integration typically happens. We know the critique is that it's on the backs of minoritized populations. Typically, they shoulder that, right? So I'm just curious if you could make the counter argument to that, even if you don't believe it.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question, and I do that in the book, right? So those are the contending philosophies in the book, right? And they're being litigated in real time by political actors, right? So there's a guy named Albert Clegg, who's Detroit's leading black nationalist, and I talk about him a lot in the book because he sort of gets the ball rolling. He sort of creates this demand for community control that ends up setting things in motion that mean that we're going to have the Milliken versus Bradley lawsuit, right? And then you've got sort of his counterpart, which is the first black member of the Detroit School Board, Remus Robinson, who's ideologically completely they're just completely opposed to each other, right? So your question though was, can I make an argument that if you're pro-democracy, you'd want to have pro-community building? Right. Yeah. And there's lots of folks who make that argument, and Clegg made that argument, right? I guess the way you would make the argument would be to say that by having lots of folks who share something in common like race in a particular defined or discrete area, they will then be able to control that area, and then through elections, folks coming from people who are elected from those particular districts are going to better represent the interests of the people there. That's the argument, right? Yeah. And look, I'm not against the idea that we need to have representation. I'm not sort of saying, well, it's terrible to have representatives who look like us and understand where we're coming from. I'm not making that argument, right? The argument that I'm making is that school integration as a social policy was a very successful social policy that most people don't appreciate. And it was a successful social policy of actually helping black children gain access to resources that they did not have access to because of segregation. And so my point of view comes out of an anti-segregation point of view. That doesn't mean I'm anti-community, doesn't mean I'm anti-black, right? I'm really not feeling segregation. I'm really not feeling it. So then the question becomes, well, what if we all just choose it? And I'm like, that's cool. The problem certainly was in the 1970s that people weren't freely choosing that. They just weren't, right? That's what the trial was about, right? People were not freely engaging in community building because they couldn't live anywhere else. People weren't freely determining where they were going to live because people like my parents had to get a white intermediary to buy the land that they built the house that I grew up in. So you're right that I'm not against constraining folks' choice, and if people want to live together who share something incredibly important together in terms of background and race and culture and all of that I take so seriously in the book, that's fine. I'm not going to be the one to make the argument. I made it as well as I'm going to make it, right? Right. I'm not going to be able to make it because I'm making another argument. Right, and I think it's one. I mean, Rick just said, and I think he was right. The integration's completely fallen off. It's just nobody talks about it, right? There are a lot of other people making the argument that you just made. A lot of folks are doing that, and what?
You made the argument.
Well, the question, the argument you asked me to make, right? And so I feel like that's covered. I feel like that's covered. I'm doing something different, and. One of the things I did say on the very last page of the book is also about default shifts, right? So a lot of times it's the people who are sort of taking the position that I take that have to make all the arguments. How would things have been different? Would everything be fabulous now, right? What about the black community, right? And I just simply suggest this. Let's just make sure that when we're asking people like me about these things, that we're asking the same hard probing question to the other folks. That's it, right? So if people are pro-charter schools, that's great. But charter schools tend to increase segregation. So explain to me all the different things that you're doing, not so that you don't have to necessarily overcome that, but let's sit down and make sure that all the benefits that you're saying black children are getting, that they're actually really getting them, right? So it's not, and I'm not necessarily saying that they're not, I'm saying let's put the same standard of review and the same standard of scrutiny on folks making the other argument that people make with respect to me.
Okay, so following up on that, that was an excellent question, is, what if you have a jurisdiction, as many are, that has given, allowed for many charter schools to form, which are charter schools are public schools for students, but that are run by private entities.
Yep.
They're not run by the government. or they have a voucher program, as many states have now. And what if those programs, whether charter or voucher, lead to schools that are in fact highly segregated by race? That is, they're racially identifiable, even racially monolithic, but test scores increase and college-going rates increase. How should we feel about that? Is that a win or not?
Well, in some respects, I think it is a win, right? Because again, I'm also not going to be in a situation, as I've gone around and talked about the book, I'm not going to look in a black parent's face and tell them what to do and how to make the best choices for their children. I'm not interested in that, right? I mean, that's not it. And so if there are charter schools that are doing that, that's great. Because what I really care about are black children. I'm obsessed with black children and black children's education. So if that's happening, that's fine. I will just simply make the same argument that I've been making, which is to say that there are other things that we get from integration that we won't tend to get if that's the case. And because statistically, African Americans have less wealth and less income, when you have large numbers of black kids together, you often have a higher incidence of poverty concentration. And statistically, when you have high incidences of poverty concentration, you tend to not have the best outcomes, right? So it's Sean Reardon just left, but he's written a lot about racial economic segregation. And that's really the sort of focus that I'm looking at now. I'm not saying you can't, and again, this is the sort of the back to the argument, like, nobody's saying black children can't learn, and nobody's saying black children can't learn together. And nobody's saying that black children can't learn in charter schools. Nobody's making that argument. But what I do want to point out is some of the statistical evidence we've seen about high levels of poverty concentration and academic success. And it tends to be that when we have lower levels of poverty concentration and more racial economic integration, we tend to have higher levels of academic success. When we look at the statistics around court-ordered desegregation, which sort of reached its peak in 1988, we closed the test score gap most aggressively during those periods of time. But it was regionalized. It was more in the South than it was in the North because desegregation was more successful in the South than it was in the North. And then as we sort of move away from 1988, and we have some of the cases that you get covered in your book, we start to weaken in some of those gains. So if people can come forward and say, you know, we're gonna provide all of these benefits to black children, I'm not going to stand there and tell them, no, you can't do that. I'm simply trying to put a light on some of the things that we haven't talked about and explain that this was a very successful social policy.
Okay, thank you. So, so I have one or two more questions, and we can take a few more questions from the audience. I want to shift to the big education case, the more recent one, Students for Fair Admissions.
Yeah.
Which we can't not talk about.
Okay.
Because that's such a monumentally important case. This is a case where the Supreme Court considered the affirmative action programs of Harvard University and the University of North Carolina and, you know, declared that they were unconstitutional because they took race into account in the admissions process. So, since then, people have extended the ruling or pushed it in all other directions. So your thoughts on, you know, Students for Fair Admissions and its aftermath, how should we feel about it? Where's it going to lead us? How should we respond?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit just when I mentioned the Dear Colleague letter. So for those of you who might not know, that the Trump administration, I think it was a Valentine's Day gift. On February 14th, they issued this Dear Colleagues letter, which basically explains the executive branch's position on sort of about the use of race in higher education. And they overread these two cases that Rick just talked about. So when I teach the Harvard UNC cases, I mean, first of all, the cases are disingenuous because I believe that they are striking down Grutter, but the court doesn't actually say that, right? So it also invites an overbroad reading of what the cases actually say. So effectively what the court says in Harvard UNC is that race as a factor, which had been the way in which selective universities had prosecuted affirmative action, is no longer good law, right? So Grutter, which was the case that was decided in 2003, basically said that you could use race as one factor in a multi-factored admissions scheme as long as you were treating each applicant as an individual in the process. So if you were looking for, if it's an undergrad scenario and you're trying to get, enough musicians to play in the band and you're trying to get athletes set it out, so this would just be one more factor. And the schools have been using that since Grutter. They were using it before Grutter because of Justice Powell's opinion in Bakke. What the court does in Harvard UNC is to say, well, race as a factor is no longer good law, but it doesn't expressly overturn the Grutter case. And that raises the question about what we talked about before, which is can you have the motivation, can you have the desire, can you have the intent to try to achieve a more racially diverse class, but just not use race as a factor in terms of how to get there. And I think that that is the correct reading of Harvard UNC. The executive branch, the Department of Education feels differently, and has read the case basically to say that you can't even have that intent. You can't have that desire. It doesn't really matter what form the desire takes, but you can't have the desire. I think that's a misreading of the case. I think it overreads it, but I do think that there's enough ambiguity there so that they can get away with it. So what should universities do now? This is sort of a restatement of what we said before. I think universities should focus on both race and economics, class. I think universities should have a renewed interest in making sure that there is diversity along class lines. And I don't know, and again, this is not something I've been focused on because I've been focused on the book in K through 12, but I think that if the universities go towards that, then they should be able to also get some racial integration. I know, Rick, that there's some debate about whether that can actually be done and what mechanisms you could use. Richard Kellenberg has a new book out about this. I haven't read it yet. I'm assuming you probably have.
I've seen it, yes.
Yeah, so there's a scholar named Richard Kellenberg who basically is saying there are ways to be able to achieve racial integration by focusing on class, and I just haven't had a chance to take a look at his book. So I think that's what we should do. I think we should take a look at Richard's book and see if we can take a leaf out of it and see if we can get it done.
Okay. Please.
Hi there. I'm a proud daughter of Flint, Michigan. I'm on staff at the law school. I was 10 years old when Milliken versus Bradley was debated, so I obviously wasn't paying a lot of attention to it at the time. I'm really excited to read your book.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to thank you for coming here.
It's my pleasure.
I agree with everything you're saying. In particular, we need more housing for so many reasons, and I do not consider that a right or a left issue at all. I think that's key to getting people to be able to live in good school districts if they want to. What was the last thing you just said? I'm nervous and it's
It's okay. You don't need to be nervous.
Acceptance of people based on class, I think, is really important. I think now that we don't have affirmative action like we used to, I think for white and black people alike, there needs to be more attention paid to the enormous class discrepancies in our society. So using that as a measure for admitting people, I think, is a really good idea. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Can't wait to read the book.
Thank you.
So, and I would like, as my last question, to know what are you hopeful about in this time? And the background for this is that I have just personally began to think about the importance of having hope and being able to find hope. It's not always just about how you read the situation and about the facts. It's more about the spirit and the sensibilities that you bring to the situation. And the hope is important because, of course, that motivates us all, right? If you have no hope, then motivation is pretty hard to come by. So we need to try to find hope. So,
I would agree.
So where do you find hope?
My heroes in this book. my heroes in the book, Remus Robinson.
And who inspires you the most? And
In
why?
the book?
Yeah. And why?
Probably, well, Remus Robinson, the first black member of the Detroit School Board, who's a prominent surgeon, amateur golf player, died pretty young of cancer, deeply democracy-loving and willing to take it from both sides. I have a lot of respect for the judge in the case, who changed. You know, everybody, there's a lot of characters in the book, and they're all really interesting. With the exception of one lawyer, the judge is the one who changes the most. And he's frustrating because you would think, you know, he knows Detroit, he knows the area, you know, he thinks the reason why Detroit looks the way it does is because people just want to live where they want to live. And you just get frustrated, you're like, dude, come on. But he's a conservative judge, and he has an open mind. He has the willingness to be persuaded. And that in a democracy is what we need. We don't need everybody to agree with us, right? We don't all necessarily agree with each other. We need to have the openness to being able to be persuaded. And that gives me hope, right? If we have enough judges who are open to being persuaded, even if we don't agree with them all the time, that is helpful. But the folks who came before us and came before me, this is a love letter to my parents' generation. And they give me hope because, I mean, I read all the media. I read my parents' media diet. And I sort of it gave me a real appreciation for what they were dealing with. My father was a lawyer in Detroit, which I talk about. And I went and I found his graduating. He went to Detroit College of Law, graduated in 1957. And I pulled his graduation, the picture of the class. And I saw that he's one of two black students, but there's only like 4 white women in the class, right? The profession has changed, and we have moved forward. And I think about sort of what he had to go through. He went to law school at night, worked his way through law school working on the line, couldn't get a deferment from the war in Korea because he was a part-time student, not a full-time student, so no deferment. And so all of the people that I got to know over the time, the ones I liked, even the ones I respected but didn't agree with, like Clegg, they all gave me hope. And I have hope in the American people. And I have hope in our democracy. I think that what's happening now is very bad. It is very bad. But I do not believe this is the end. And so I also believe that it's incumbent upon us, or maybe a day or two older, to provide some sense of normalcy and stability for the younger generation, for the law students that we teach. And that's the other thing that I try very much to do. So that's how I felt.
Thank you. I did one more question. Really close it out. 'Cause you mentioned your parents, and I'm wondering now about what's not in the book and things that are not in the book. And this is such a deeply personal journey for you. Can you say anything about ways you came to understand your parents differently in their lives and their struggle?
I'll tell you the one thing. Growing up, I thought my mother was just a pain in the ass. And, you know, she's a beauty queen, and she always had to be dressed to the nines when she was like going to the grocery store. And I got to a certain age, I'm like, why are we spending all this money on the da-da-da-da-da-da? You know, and I can see now that I was just a smart ass. But then, when I went back and I looked, and I spent a lot of time in her world, I understood why it was so important for her to be turned out when she left the house, and why it was important to drive a late model car, because she was disrespected, and her beauty and her brilliance were not allowed to flourish. And so all these black characters in the book, Clegg is another one, brilliant guy, wanted to be a journalist, gets to Oberlin, they won't let him be on the journalism, he won't let him be on the school newspaper. This kind of thing, you know, these are soul-destroying type things. And so, you know, the ways in which my parents behaved, and particularly my mom, all came into view for me when I spent the time sort of looking at all that, all the media, and being able to put it into perspective, and I'm sorry that they're not with us now.
Thank you for that. Thank you all.